It was always night in the city of Torvalis. The sun had been missing for decades, swallowed by a mysterious event known as the eclipse, leaving only an endless, oppressive twilight that stretched across the skyline. People learned to live in the gloom, adjusting their lives to the absence of daylight. But the true horror was not the lack of sunlight, but what came with it: monsters, creatures from a parallel world that lived only in the dark, unseen by the naked eye. When the eclipse happened, it was more than just a natural phenomenon. It was the barrier between two worlds breaking down. The creatures that had lived in the shadows of the parallel realm began to slip through the rift, entering Torvalis, drawn by the fear and chaos the humans radiated. At first, there were only whispers of strange sounds, fleeting glimpses of figures in the corner of one's vision. But soon, they grew bolder, more dangerous. The monsters had no shape, no form that could be recognized in the light of day. Their true appearance could only be seen in the dark or through special devices. Devices that were now the last line of defense against the creatures that could kill without leaving a trace. People used to laugh about the old stories of monsters, thinking they were nothing but myths and legends. But now, they had no choice but to face the truth. The creatures were real. And they were everywhere. Each night, a select group of warriors known as the Shadow Guards would venture into the darkness. These trained individuals were the only ones who stood a chance against the creatures, armed with devices known as spectral lenses. The lenses allowed them to see the hidden monsters, but they didn't come without a price. The lenses were not perfect. They distorted the creatures' shapes, making it impossible to know exactly how many were lurking nearby. The lenses only showed glimpses of what was in the shadows. Sometimes, those glimpses were enough to survive, but more often than not, they weren't. Amara Derrick was one of these shadow guards. She had been born after the eclipse, and the night had always been her enemy. She grew up listening to the stories her father told her, of how things used to be, when the sun shone brightly and the world was safe. But those days were gone. In their place was a nightmarish reality, where the unknown stalked every corner of the city. Tonight, like every other, Amara was preparing to venture into the deep recesses of the city, where the darkness held more than just the usual creatures. There were rumors of something worse lurking in the shadows. Something new. It had been killing without leaving any trace at all, and the Shadow Guards had no idea what they were facing. "Are you ready, Amara?" called a voice from the doorway. It was her partner, Kael, a seasoned Shadow Guard with a sharp, calm demeanor. His eyes gleamed with the familiar coldness of someone who had learned to accept the inevitable, to embrace the darkness and use it as a weapon. Amara nodded, tightening the straps of her armor and checking her spectral lens. She could feel the weight of it around her neck, the device that was both her protection and her curse. It had saved her life more times than she cared to count, but it also had a strange effect on the mind. When she wore the lens, the world seemed off-kilter, twisted. The shadows stretched unnaturally, and sometimes, she swore she could hear whispers in the back of her mind, voices that didn't belong to the living. "Tonight's not going to be easy," Kael continued, his voice low. "We've received word that something's different. This isn't just another hunt." Amara glanced at him, feeling a chill run down her spine. "What do you mean, different?" "We don't know yet, but whatever it is, it's stronger. And smarter." Kael's fingers brushed the hilt of his blade, a weapon infused with a rare metal capable of harming the creatures. "We'll stick together, watch each other's backs." The shadows outside the small barracks of the Shadow Guards were already beginning to creep in. Night had fallen, and with it, the creatures would stir. It was a world that few truly understood, one where light meant safety, but only for a fleeting moment. Once the light was gone, all that remained was the darkness, and the monsters that ruled it. Amara adjusted her lens and followed Kael into the unknown, where the creatures waited. Tonight, she knew, would test them in ways they couldn't predict. She could feel it in her bones. Something was coming. Something worse than anything they had faced before. And it was only a matter of time before they encountered it. The city of Torvelis was a labyrinth of crumbling buildings and narrow alleyways. The streets were slick with the remnants of an eternal mist that never quite lifted, clinging to the ground like a second skin. Amara followed Kael through the city, their footsteps muffled by the thick fog. The air was heavy, thick with the smell of rust and decay. It was the kind of night where even the bravest felt the weight of uncertainty pressing down on them. The creatures were out there, lurking, waiting. Amara's hand instinctively went to the hilt of her blade, though she knew it wasn't enough to keep her safe from the horrors that hid in the shadows. The spectral lens around her neck gave her a false sense of security. It was a tool, a vital one, but it was never perfect. The monsters, whatever they were, had a way of slipping through its lens, remaining just out of sight. The device could show her their shapes, their glowing eyes, but it could never show her how many there were or where they would strike next. "We're heading to the Hollow District," Kael said, his voice breaking through her thoughts. "It's where the signal came from. The new thing. Something's been stirring down there. People have gone missing." Amara's stomach twisted at the mention of the Hollow District. It was an area of the city that had once been a thriving neighborhood, but now it was little more than a place where shadows thrived. The district had become a no-man's land, where the brave, or the desperate, ventured in only to never return. It was a place where the rift between worlds seemed thin, where the monsters were most numerous. "Do you think it's the same kind of creature we've been facing?" she asked, her voice low. "I'm not sure," Kael replied. "Whatever it is, it's different. Too silent, too clean. There's no blood, no traces. People vanish as if they were never there." The hairs on the back of Amara's neck stood on end as they reached the edge of the Hollow District. The fog grew thicker here, swirling around their feet as though it were alive. The sound of distant whispers filled the air, and the hairs on her skin tingled. The creatures were close. She could feel it. Kael motioned for her to be silent, and they moved cautiously down an alleyway, keeping close to the walls. The fog seemed to thicken, wrapping around them like a shroud. In the distance, a faint glow flickered from a broken streetlight, casting long, eerie shadows on the cracked pavement. "Stay alert," Kael whispered. "The spectral lens will only show us part of what's out there. We have to trust our instincts." Amara nodded. She had seen the lens fail before, showing creatures in the wrong places, or worse, not showing them at all. But there was something else Kael hadn't said. They weren't just hunting the monsters tonight. They were hunting something that might be smarter than they were. They reached the center of the district, where the old church stood, its bell tower shattered and its windows boarded up. It was here that the first of the disappearances had been reported. The ground was littered with debris, broken glass, twisted metal, and the remnants of burned-out cars. The area felt abandoned, forgotten by the world above. Amara's heart pounded in her chest as she scanned the surroundings. The darkness pressed in, and she could hear the soft rustling of something moving just beyond the reach of the glow from her lens. The air was still, too still. It felt as if time itself had stopped. "Something's wrong," she muttered. "It's too quiet." Kael nodded but didn't speak. His grip tightened on his weapon, and Amara did the same. They advanced into the churchyard, each step careful, each movement calculated. It was then that Amara noticed the first sign of the creatures, the faintest trace of an outline in the fog, flickering in the corner of her vision. She snapped her lens into place, and the world around her shifted. Shapes began to form, twisted, elongated figures that seemed to bend in impossible ways. Some were hunched low to the ground, their faces obscured by shadows, but their eyes gleamed bright, like points of light in the abyss. Others stood upright, towering over her, their forms too unnatural to comprehend. "They're here," Amara whispered, her voice trembling. But before Kael could respond, a screeching sound cut through the air, and a wave of darkness surged forward, swallowing the faint light of the street lamps. A creature lunged from the darkness, faster than Amara could react. She barely had time to raise her blade before it was upon her, its long claws reaching for her throat. She twisted just in time, and the creature's claws scraped across her armor, leaving deep scratches. "Kael!" she shouted, but he was already there. His blade slashed through the air, cutting through the creature's form with an almost unnatural precision. The monster let out a horrific screech, disintegrating into shadows as Kael struck it down. "We've got to keep moving," Kael ordered, his eyes scanning the surroundings. "More are coming. Stay close." But as they moved deeper into the churchyard, the very air seemed to change. The creatures weren't attacking in the same way anymore. They were evolving, adapting. They no longer relied on brute force alone. They were hunting now, and they were learning. Amara's lens flickered, distorting the creature's shapes in the dark. One creature stood still, motionless, as though waiting for them to come closer. It had no eyes, no visible mouth, only a gaping hole where its face should have been. Its form shimmered like smoke, constantly shifting. "Kael, I don't think it's one of them," Amara said, her voice barely a whisper. "It's something else." Before Kael could respond, the creature vanished, melting into the shadows. But its presence remained, an oppressive weight in the air. The hunt had begun. The silence that followed the disappearance of the creature was suffocating. Amara's heart hammered in her chest, her breath shallow and rapid as she tried to steady herself. The weight of the lens around her neck felt heavier than ever before. For all the strange shapes it showed her, all the glimpses it offered of the monsters lurking in the shadows, it could never show her the true nature of what was hunting them now. Kael's voice broke the tension. "We need to move, now." Without another word, he grabbed her arm, pulling her away from the churchyard and toward a narrow side street. The creatures were still out there, watching them. But there was something else, too. A presence, something ancient and terrifying, that had never been felt before in Torvelis. The creatures were not just attacking. They were guiding them. And this new thing, this darker force, seemed to be orchestrating it all. Amara stumbled, her thoughts racing as they navigated the dark streets. Her eyes constantly flicked back to the fog behind them, where she thought she saw something shifting, moving in the periphery of her vision. But every time she turned to face it directly, the creature was gone, leaving only the feeling of its presence. The air felt thicker here, as if the darkness itself had weight. "What the hell was that thing?" Amara asked, her voice barely above a whisper as they reached the mouth of another alley. She could feel the cold sweat beading on her skin. The creature they had just encountered was like no other she had ever seen. Its shape was constantly shifting, as though it were made of shadow itself. "I don't know," Kael replied, his eyes scanning the street. "But it's not one of the usual monsters. This one doesn't attack the same way. It's not here for a fight. It's here for something else." Amara looked at him, her brow furrowing. "Something else? What do you mean?" Kael hesitated, his gaze drifting toward the end of the alley where the fog seemed to thicken even more. "I don't think these creatures are just random. I think they're after something, or someone. And we're the bait." A cold chill ran through Amara's veins as she realized the truth of his words. They weren't just hunting monsters anymore. They were being hunted themselves. The two of them pressed on, their movements swift but cautious. Amara could feel her pulse racing, the darkness pressing in around them. Her lens flickered again, and for a split second, she saw something, an image that made her blood run cold. The fog ahead of them was swirling unnaturally, forming shapes that shouldn't have been there. Figures, humanoid figures, tall and gaunt, with long, crooked limbs. Their eyes glowed faintly, like embers smoldering in the dark. But these weren't creatures. They were something different. "They're waiting for us," Kael muttered, his voice tense. "We've walked right into their trap." Before Amara could ask what he meant, the first of the creatures lunged from the darkness. It was like a shadow with claws, silent, fast, and deadly. The only thing visible were its glowing eyes, flickering like stars in the vastness of the night. It moved in a blur, attacking with a speed that made it impossible for Amara to react. The creature's claws slashed across her chest, leaving a long, painful gash in her armor. She staggered backward, but Kael was already there, his blade cleaving through the air in a swift arc. The creature screeched as Kael's blade connected, but it didn't die. Instead, it seemed to melt into the fog, vanishing like smoke. Amara's heart pounded in her chest as she tried to regain her balance. What the hell is going on? Why are they disappearing? Kael didn't answer. Instead, he raised his hand, signaling for silence. He was listening. Amara did the same, holding her breath as the world around them seemed to hold its own. And then she heard it, the faintest sound, like a whisper carried on the wind. It wasn't coming from the creatures, though. It was something else, something older. A voice, but not a human one. The sound was low, guttural, a chorus of voices overlapping. It was the kind of sound that crawled into your mind and twisted it, filling you with a cold dread. The more she listened, the more it felt like the voices were speaking directly to her, whispering something she couldn't quite understand. "Do you hear that?" Amara asked, her voice trembling. Kael's eyes narrowed, his grip tightening on his blade. "It's coming from the church. We need to get to the center. Now." Before Amara could ask more, Kael was already moving, pulling her along with him. They ran through the alleyways, their footsteps echoing in the oppressive silence. The fog seemed to grow thicker with every step they took, and the whispers grew louder, as though the voices were calling to them, urging them forward. The church was not far now, and Amara could see its broken silhouette rising ahead of them. But something had changed. The air felt heavier here, as if it were saturated with a presence that was both alien and ancient. As they approached the broken doors of the church, Kael motioned for her to stop. "This is it," Kael said softly. "Whatever it is we've been tracking, it's here." Amara could feel her pulse quickening as she surveyed the church. The building was old, worn down by time and neglect, its windows shattered and its walls covered in the grime of decades. But there was something else, a strange glow emanating from within, faint but undeniable. It was as though the church itself was alive, breathing with the darkness. Kael turned to her, his eyes steely with determination. "Stay close, and whatever happens, don't let go of your lens." Amara nodded, her breath catching in her throat. She could feel the tension in the air thickening, the whispering voices now almost deafening. Something was inside, waiting, and they were about to find out exactly what it was. Amara's breath caught in her throat as she stepped over the threshold of the church. The temperature seemed to drop immediately, the cold seeping into her bones. The air was thick with the smell of mold and something else, something darker, like ancient decay, the scent of things long forgotten. Kael's hand rested lightly on her arm, urging her forward. His eyes were narrowed, scanning every corner of the dimly lit interior. The flickering light from their spectral lenses revealed the true horror of the place. The once majestic church now stood in ruins, its high ceilings collapsed in places, the stained glass windows shattered, their pieces scattered like broken dreams on the floor. Yet, despite the disrepair, there was a palpable energy in the air. Something ancient and dangerous, pulsing from deep within the church's heart. Amara could feel it now, the same oppressive weight she had felt outside, only stronger here. It was like the very walls were alive with a dark presence. They crept deeper into the nave, their footsteps muted by the thick layer of dust. The whispers that had been feigned on the streets were louder here. The voices were clearer now, more distinct. They weren't speaking in a language she recognized, but they carried a sense of familiarity. She could almost feel the meaning behind them, a kind of invitation. "You hear that?" Amara whispered, her voice trembling. Kael nodded, but his expression was grim. "I do. We're not alone." The whispers continued, rising in volume as they moved deeper into the church. It felt as though the very walls were bending toward them, leaning in with eager anticipation. Something was waiting. Something ancient, something far older than the creatures they had been hunting. They reached the center of the church, and that was when Amara saw it, a faint, eerie glow coming from the altar. It was a pulsing light, rhythmic, as if the church itself was breathing in time with it. The glow seemed to shift, an unnatural color, swirling with tendrils of shadow that reached out like fingers. Kael held up his hand, signaling for Amara to stop. He was still for a moment, his gaze fixed on the altar. His expression was unreadable, but Amara could see the tension in his jaw, the way his muscles were coiled, ready to spring into action. "There it is," he said, barely a whisper. Amara strained her eyes, trying to make sense of the source of the light. But it wasn't something solid. It was more like a distortion in the air itself, a space between realities, a tear in the fabric of the world. It shifted constantly, warping, as if something was trying to force its way through. Suddenly, the floor beneath them creaked, and Amara's heart skipped a beat. The whispers became louder, and then, from the shadows surrounding the altar, figures began to emerge, humanoid shapes, towering and gaunt, their limbs twisted and elongated. Their eyes were empty voids, black as the deepest night, but in the center of their faces, a pale, flickering light burned. A light that pulsed in rhythm with the glow from the altar. "They've been waiting for us," Kael muttered, his grip tightening on his weapon. Amara's eyes widened as the creatures took slow, deliberate steps toward them. They didn't make a sound as they moved, but the weight of their presence was enough to send a wave of dread over her. They didn't look like the other monsters they had faced before. These were different, more intelligent, more purposeful. Kael's eyes darted around the room, calculating. "We can't fight them here. Not with that rift open. We need to stop whatever's causing it." Amara nodded, her pulse pounding in her ears. She knew Kael was right. These creatures weren't just random beasts. They were guardians, protectors of whatever lay beyond the rift. And whatever was causing it, whatever force was pushing through, was powerful enough to make even these creatures bow to it. "Do you have a plan?" Amara asked, her voice tight. Kael's eyes flicked to the altar, where the pulsing light grew brighter. "We stopped the rift. If we can close it, we'll stop the creatures from coming through. But we need to get close enough." Before Amara could respond, one of the creatures lunged forward with incredible speed, its claws extended toward her. She barely had time to react, raising her blade just in time to deflect the strike. The creature's claws scraped across her armor, leaving deep gouges. Amara gritted her teeth and twisted, bringing her blade down in a vicious arc. It connected, but the creature seemed to melt away like smoke, vanishing back into the shadows with a low, eerie hiss. But more followed. One after another, the gaunt figures emerged from the darkness, their glowing eyes fixed on Amara and Kael, their movements slow and deliberate, as if they were toying with them, playing a game of cat and mouse. "Keep moving," Kael shouted, grabbing Amara by the arm and pulling her toward the altar. They ran, the creatures pursuing them relentlessly, but there was no sound of their footsteps. They were silent hunters, moving with unnatural speed and precision, closing the gap between them with every passing second. Amara's heart raced, and her breath came in ragged gasps as they neared the altar. The pulsing light seemed to grow brighter, blinding now, and as they drew closer, she could feel the very air around them vibrating. It was as though the rift itself was alive, a living, breathing thing that hungered for more. "We're almost there," Kael called, his voice strained. The altar was within reach now, and Amara could see a faint inscription carved into the stone, glowing with the same unnatural light. It looked like an ancient language, one she didn't recognize. The moment her fingers brushed the stone, the ground trembled, and the entire church seemed to shudder. A deafening screech filled the air, and the creatures stopped in their tracks, their heads jerking toward the altar. The light from the rift flickered, as if it were about to collapse in on itself. Amara could feel the pull of it now, a magnetic force that threatened to draw her in. "No," Kael shouted, "don't touch it," but it was too late. As Amara's hand made contact with the stone, a violent surge of energy erupted from the altar. The creatures howled, their forms writhing in agony as the rift began to tear open wider, spilling more shadows into the church. The very air around them seemed to warp, and Amara could feel herself being pulled toward the center of the rift, her body fighting against the force but losing the battle. Kael lunged forward, grabbing her wrist, trying to pull her back. But the force was too strong, and just as he managed to grip her arm, a shadowed tendril shot out from the altar, wrapping around them both. "No!" Kael screamed, his voice laced with panic, as they were both sucked into the rift. Amara felt her body jerk violently, as if the world around her was being torn apart, piece by piece. The sensation was disorienting, like falling through a dream, with the very fabric of reality unraveling. There was no light, no solid ground, only the endless pull of the rift dragging her deeper into the unknown. She tried to scream, but no sound came. Her vision blurred, her thoughts scattering like leaves in a storm. The sensation of weightlessness made her stomach lurch, and it felt as though she were falling into an abyss that had no end. Her hand instinctively reached for her spectral lens, but it slipped from her grip, swallowed by the darkness. Kael's grip on her wrist tightened, pulling her toward him in the swirling chaos. She could feel his arm, his presence beside her, but everything else was a blur, a terrifying, incomprehensible blur. Then, suddenly, the sensation stopped. Amara gasped for air, her body slamming into solid ground with a force that knocked the wind out of her. She lay there for a moment, disoriented and gasping, as though the world had shifted violently beneath her. Her senses were still spinning, her body aching, but slowly, the disorienting pull of the rift faded. She blinked her eyes open, and her breath caught in her throat. They were no longer in the church, no longer in the city of Torvelis. They were somewhere else, somewhere dark, but not in the same oppressive, fog-filled way as before. This was a place where the darkness seemed to stretch on forever, a void so deep that even the faintest glimmer of light seemed to be swallowed whole. The ground beneath her was smooth, cold stone, unlike anything she had felt before. It was as though she had been transported to another world entirely. Kael was already on his feet, scanning the surroundings with a mixture of caution and determination. He didn't speak, but his expression told Amara everything she needed to know. They were in a place they should not be, an alien world, one that was not meant for human eyes. "Where are we?" Amara asked, her voice hoarse. "I don't know," Kael replied, his gaze fixed on the shifting shadows around them. "But we're no longer in Torvelis. This is the realm on the other side of the rift, the place where the creatures come from." Amara's stomach churned at the realization. This was it, the heart of the creatures' world. She had heard rumors of it, but to actually be standing in it felt like a nightmare made real. The air was thick with a strange, unnatural energy that seemed to pulse with life. The shadows themselves felt alive, moving and shifting in ways that made Amara's skin crawl. I don't know how to explain it," Amara muttered, trying to steady herself. "But it feels like we're being watched." Kael's eyes narrowed. He had already started moving, his boots silent against the stone floor as he stepped forward. "We are being watched. Stay close, and keep your wits about you." Amara nodded, forcing herself to her feet. Her limbs felt heavy, like they were moving through a thick fog, but she could feel Kael's presence beside her, steady and reassuring. The two of them moved forward, the shadows closing in behind them, as though they were being herded deeper into the heart of this strange realm. The silence here was unnerving, broken only by the soft sounds of their footsteps. It was as if the entire world was holding its breath. There was no wind, no rustling of leaves, no sounds of life, just a suffocating, unnatural stillness that made every movement feel like a violation of the very air. Then, ahead, a faint light appeared. It was a soft, flickering glow, like the light from a dying fire, barely perceptible against the vast darkness that surrounded them. Kael paused, his body tense, his eyes focused on the source of the light. "That wasn't here before," he murmured, his hand instinctively going to the hilt of his blade. Amara felt a chill run down her spine. The light seemed to beckon, drawing them forward, promising answers, or perhaps danger. "What do you think it is?" Amara whispered, though she already knew the answer. Kael didn't reply at first. He just kept his eyes trained on the flickering glow, his expression darkening. Whatever it is, it's not natural. Let's approach carefully. They moved forward cautiously, every step measured. As the light grew stronger, its glow more defined. The shadows seemed to retreat from it, warping and twisting like smoke being pushed away by an unseen wind. As they drew closer, the light solidified into something tangible, a structure. It wasn't like anything Amara had ever seen before, tall, angular, and made of some material that shimmered in the dim light. It looked like a monument, an altar of sorts, though the design was unlike anything human hands had ever crafted. The surface of the structure seemed to pulse with the same eerie energy that filled the air, and the stone was covered in strange markings, symbols, lines, and glyphs that shifted in the dim light, as if they were alive, moving beneath her gaze. "This is it," Kael said softly, his voice filled with a mixture of awe and dread. "This is the source, the heart of the rift." Amara stared at the structure, her mind racing. Everything in her told her to turn back, to escape before they went any further. But the pull of the rift, the draw of the unknown, was too strong. They had to understand what was happening, why the creatures were attacking, why the rift had opened in the first place. Kael stepped forward, his hand reaching toward the structure. But before he could touch it, the air around them shimmered violently, and the ground beneath their feet trembled. "No," Kael muttered, his eyes wide with realization. "It's too late." Amara didn't have time to react. From the shadows surrounding them, the creatures began to emerge. Dozens of them, their glowing eyes piercing the darkness, their forms taking shape from the very shadows themselves. They were no longer silent, no longer moving like mindless beasts. They were coordinated now, moving with purpose, as though they were responding to a call. And then, from the center of the structure, a deep, resonating voice echoed through the void. "You should not have come." The words were not spoken with sound, but with a force that shook the very air around them. Amara's breath caught in her throat, and her vision blurred. The voice came from everywhere at once, as if the very world was speaking to them. Kael stepped back, his face grim. "We're too late. The rift is fully open." Before Amara could ask what he meant, the ground beneath them shook violently. The structure in front of them began to crack, and the creatures surged forward, their eyes glowing brighter, their movements faster. Amara's mind raced. They had to escape. They had to close the rift before it was too late. But as the creatures advanced, Amara felt the weight of their presence, the darkness closing in. There was no way out now. The rift had come to life, and they were trapped in its heart. The creatures closed in, their glowing eyes reflecting an eerie light in the oppressive darkness. Amara's breath quickened, her heart hammering in her chest as the ground beneath her trembled with the force of the rift's expansion. The strange energy that permeated the air felt like it was pressing in on them from every side, suffocating them with its weight. "Kael," Amara shouted, her voice trembling. "What do we do?" Kael's eyes were scanning their surroundings, his grip tightening on his weapon. The creatures were closing in, moving with unnatural precision. There was no way out. There was nowhere to run. "We fight." His voice was steely, but there was an underlying urgency. "We hold them off long enough to figure out how to shut down the rift." Amara felt the sickening pull of despair wrap around her heart, but she nodded, drawing her blade and steeling herself for the fight. There was no other choice. They had come too far to fail now. Kael's sword flashed in the dim light, cutting through the air with lethal precision as he swung it at the nearest creature. The blade connected with the creature's ethereal form, but instead of cutting through it, the creature absorbed the strike, dissolving into a swirl of shadows that reformed moments later. It hissed, its glowing eyes locked on Kael as it darted toward him with predatory speed. Amara rushed to Kael's side, slashing her blade at the creature that had lunged at him. Her sword cut through the shadow, but like Kael's, it did nothing to truly harm it. The creature melted away, its form reforming with a sickening screech. The creatures were relentless. Every strike they made simply pushed the shadows further into the world. Every slash, every blow only seemed to feed the rift more, strengthening it. The energy in the air grew even more oppressive, vibrating with a dark hum that made Amara's teeth ache. She could hear Kael's heavy breathing beside her. The sweat trickled down his face, but he was still moving with deadly efficiency, fending off creatures with swift, precise strikes. His gaze flickered toward the glowing structure, and for a brief moment, Amara saw the determination in his eyes. "They're not just attacking us," Kael said through gritted teeth, slashing his blade through the air again. "They're feeding the rift. We need to stop them from reaching it, or we're done." Amara's head spun as she processed his words. "How do we stop them? How do we close the rift?" Kael didn't answer immediately. His eyes darted toward the center of the structure, where the pulsing glow was strongest. "We have to destroy the source. The rift is being sustained by whatever that thing is. But to do that," he looked at her, his eyes filled with grim understanding, "we're going to have to pay the price." Amara frowned, confusion clouding her mind. "What do you mean? What price?" Kael's face tightened, and for the first time, there was a flicker of uncertainty in his gaze. "The power that sustains this rift, this place, it's not something that can be destroyed without consequences. The rift exists in a balance. We take the energy from it, and we destroy it, but in doing so, we'll unleash something darker. Something far worse than these creatures." Amara's heart dropped. "You're saying if we close it, something worse will come?" Kael nodded grimly. "Yes, and that something will be coming for us." The realization hit Amara like a physical blow. They were stuck in a nightmare, and their only way out was to risk everything. The creatures attacking them were horrifying, but if they destroyed the source, they might unleash something that could end their lives far more brutally. "We don't have a choice," Kael continued, his voice hardening. "If we don't act now, the rift will spread, and these creatures will flood our world. We'll have no place left to hide." Amara nodded, her resolve hardening. She had seen too much, fought too hard to let it end this way. They had to stop the rift, no matter the cost, even if it meant facing the horrors that might follow. "We'll do it," she said, her voice steady despite the fear gnawing at her insides. "We'll stop the rift, but how do we destroy it?" Kael turned back to the structure, his eyes focused intently on the strange, shifting symbols that seemed to pulse in time with the rift. He took a deep breath, as if gathering himself for something monumental. "The structure," he said quietly. "It's a key that opens and closes the rift. But we can't just destroy it. We need to use its power. I've seen rituals like this before, old, forbidden magic. If we channel the energy into the center of the altar, we can collapse the rift. But it requires a sacrifice. The energy is not something that can be contained." Amara's blood ran cold. "What kind of sacrifice?" Kael didn't look at her as he spoke. His gaze was fixed on the glowing symbols, the pulsing energy. "It means giving up everything. Our strength, our life force, everything we are. The rift won't close unless it's fed with a life." Amara's breath caught in her throat. She understood now. The price of power. They were being asked to sacrifice themselves to stop the rift. "I'll do it," she said, her voice firm, though her heart ached with the weight of the decision. "I'll do whatever it takes to close the rift." Kael's gaze shot to her, his face twisted with something between disbelief and anger. "No, you don't understand. This isn't just giving up your life. It's everything. If you feed the altar with your essence, you'll disappear. Your soul, your body, it'll all be consumed. There won't be anything left of you." Amara stepped forward, her expression resolute. "We don't have time for hesitation. If we don't do this, we're both dead anyway. And if it means saving Torbelis, saving everyone, I'll pay that price." For a long moment, Kael said nothing. His eyes searched hers, his expression flickering between sorrow and determination. Finally, he spoke, his voice rough. "Then we do this together." Before Amara could respond, a massive screech split the air. The creatures were closing in faster now, their movements chaotic, desperate. They could feel the rift collapsing, and they were fighting for survival. "Get to the altar," Kael ordered, his voice booming over the chaos. Amara turned and ran, her heart pounding in her chest as she sprinted toward the structure. The creatures followed, howling in fury, but she didn't stop. She couldn't. They had no time to waste. As she reached the altar, she felt the pull of the rift growing stronger. The energy was raw, overwhelming, and for a split second, she feared she might be consumed before she could act. But then, Kael was beside her, his hand resting on the altar, his face pale but determined. Together, they placed their hands on the stone. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the ground trembled violently beneath them, and the rift surged with an unbearable force. The altar glowed brighter, its energy twisting around them like a vortex, pulling at their very beings. Amara's vision blurred. She could feel herself slipping away, the energy draining her strength, but she held on, holding her ground. Kael was beside her, his face strained with the effort. And then, in the final moment, the light from the altar erupted, and the rift began to collapse. But as the rift closed, something else stirred. Something darker. The final surge of energy from the altar was blinding, a raw, unbearable force that consumed everything around Amara. She could feel it, deep in her bones, the very core of her being, pulling at her, ripping away her strength. The darkness seemed to tear apart, and for a brief moment, she was floating in a void. There was no ground beneath her, no air to breathe, only an endless abyss. She felt Kael's hand in hers, his grip strong, but even that was beginning to slip away. His touch, once warm and reassuring, was growing colder, more distant. And then, nothing. The world came crashing back, and Amara hit the ground with a force that knocked the wind from her lungs. She gasped for air, her body heavy, her mind fuzzy. The air around her was thick with smoke and the remnants of the collapsing rift. She could hear nothing but the pounding of her heart, each beat deafening in her ears. Amara's eyes fluttered open, blinking against the sudden rush of light and color. She was no longer standing in the strange, alien world. She was back in the church. The altar was still there, though the pulsing light had dimmed, almost to nothing. The rift was closed. The creatures were gone. She tried to sit up, but her body felt heavy, drained. She could hear footsteps. Kael was beside her, his figure slowly coming into focus. He, too, was on the ground, breathing heavily, his face pale. His sword was still clutched in his hand, but he seemed far more fragile now, as if the very act of closing the rift had taken something from him. "Kael," Amara whispered, reaching for him. Her voice was weak, almost unrecognizable. He lifted his head slowly, his eyes meeting hers. There was an unreadable expression on his face. He was alive. They had done it, but at what cost? "The rift is closed," he said hoarsely. His voice sounded distant, like it was coming from a long way away. "But something else is wrong." Amara tried to speak, but her throat felt like it was lined with ash. She coughed violently, the remnants of the rift's energy still swirling in the air around them. It was like an aftershock, a lingering pulse of dark energy that hadn't quite dissipated. She finally managed to sit up, her body protesting every movement. The world around them was quiet, eerily so. The creatures, the monsters that had plagued them, were gone. But the church itself was now dark and desolate. The air, once thick with dread, had settled into a suffocating silence. "Kael, what do you mean something's wrong?" Amara asked, her voice barely a whisper. Kael turned his head slightly, his eyes scanning the space around them. His gaze flickered toward the altar, where the rift had once been. "The rift is closed, but there's something else. I feel it. Something has been left behind." He paused, his expression shifting. He looked at her then, his eyes filled with a kind of strange fear, something that wasn't there before. "Amara, I think we've unleashed something worse than the creatures." Amara's heart skipped a beat. She tried to steady herself, her mind racing. They had already seen horrors beyond imagination. The creatures, the rift, the sacrifices. Could there really be something worse than all of that? "What do you mean?" she asked again, her breath shaky. Kael hesitated. I don't know how to explain it, but when the rift collapsed, I felt it. Something in the air, something that wasn't there before. Something ancient, alive. Amara's pulse quickened. She could feel it now. A subtle shift in the air, as though the world around them had changed, bent in a way that shouldn't be possible. Her vision blurred again, and for a moment, she thought she saw movement in the shadows at the edges of the church. Faint, but unmistakable. Something watching them. What's happening? She asked, her voice trembling. Suddenly, the ground beneath them rumbled, faint but undeniable. Amara's eyes widened as the church walls groaned, their ancient stone foundations shaking. Something was coming. Something far worse than the creatures. Get up, Kael shouted, his voice urgent now. He staggered to his feet, grabbing Amara's arm and pulling her up with him. She could feel the tremor in his hands, the panic in his gaze. Run, he ordered. They didn't need to be told twice. Amara's legs felt like lead as they sprinted toward the church's exit, the sound of footsteps pounding behind them. But this time, it wasn't just the sound of their own feet. Something else was following them, its presence growing stronger, closer. They burst through the church doors, the cool night air a sharp contrast to the oppressive heat inside. Amara gasped for breath, her lungs burning, but Kael didn't stop. He kept running, pulling her along, his face twisted in concentration. Behind them, the air seemed to warp again. Shadows spilled from the church like ink, flooding the streets. But these shadows were different. They were thicker, more solid. And within them, there were eyes, glowing, hungry eyes, blinking into existence as they swirled with an unnatural, almost sentient movement. Kael, Amara gasped. What is that? Kael didn't answer. He just kept running, his eyes darting nervously to the growing shadows. The creatures that had once plagued their world, those twisted, monstrous beings, were now more than just flesh and bone. They had taken on something else, something far darker. Amara's heart raced in her chest as she realized the truth. The creatures weren't just bound by the rift. They had become something else in the process. And whatever had come through with the rift's collapse wasn't just trying to break into their world. It was taking it over, slowly but surely, transforming the very fabric of reality into something far worse. As they reached the edge of the city, the ground trembled once more, but this time, it wasn't just a rumble, it was a roar. The earth cracked beneath them, the air split with an agonizing screech. Amara stumbled, nearly falling as she looked over her shoulder. From the shattered remnants of the church, the shadows had fully taken shape. But it wasn't just creatures now. From the depths of the rift, something else was rising, a dark, towering form, its silhouette massive against the moonless sky. Kael didn't stop. We need to keep moving. We have to find a way to stop it, before it's too late. Amara nodded, fear clawing at her chest, but she didn't question him. There was no time for hesitation. The world around them was collapsing, and the true horrors, the ones they had never even imagined, were beginning to take their place.